Without any further ado, let's bring on our first speaker, Richard Hall. Richard Hall is a dear friend of myself and my husband, Robert Switek, who's another speaker. We have all been struggling and working hard in the Fund for UFO Research, which has many varied projects always ongoing, like juggling a lot of balls. Dick Hall was the past chairman of the fund, and under his leadership, I think the fund had really grown and has really ventured out into new ways of educating the public, as well as plunging money back into actual physical research. Dick Hall's past with the subject is over 50 years. He was back with NICAP, which was, as you recall, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena. He was an aide to Major Donald E. Kehoe, and that name should ring a bell, as a major mover and shaker in the field and a real spokesperson for UFOs for a different era. In the 60s, Richard Hall served as a consultant to the University of Colorado UFO Project and contributed an article in Encyclopedia Britannica. His biggest work in the field is the UFO Evidence, which was written originally in 1964. He has written the UFO Evidence Part 2 and is currently looking for a publisher. Without any further ado, Richard Hall.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see such a big turnout from members of the Church of UFO Believers. For those of you who don't know what I'm alluding to, there was some sort of coverage in the Washington Post this morning. That's what they called us. Today I'm going to be talking about a little bit about my long experience in the field, but the focus is going to be on the lessons I've learned about the barriers that are out there to acceptance of UFOs as a real serious, meaningful scientific mystery. I was thinking about this last night, and it makes me feel like Methuselah, but I've been here and experienced every single major UFO wave of modern times, starting with 1947, when I was a high school student. And so I think I have something worthwhile to offer in talking about some of my experiences. There have been lots of things that seem obvious in the past in the scientific world and in the UFO world. UFOs seem very obvious to us, those of us who have studied it critically and for a long period of time. And you begin wondering, what is taking so long? Why can't this be accepted by the major institutions of society, like the news media and the scientific community? Well, I'm going to be giving some of the reasons why I think this is so today, but any attempt to analyze this, the first place we have to look is in the mirror, because we have done a very poor job overall of presenting the information in a way that can be clearly understood and appreciated. Where we are today with UFOs, I think, is similar to some other things in the history of science. It was once believed that meteorites couldn't fall from the sky because there were no stones in the sky. That's just one example, and I believe it was the Astronomer Royal of England who stated that space travel is utter bilge. So science can be very wrong at times. That doesn't mean you throw out the science. You try to correct it. I think today we're sort of in the same place. There can't be alien contact going on because there are no aliens visiting us. It's clear, it's obvious to scientists. And so there's a chasm there that we need to bridge. I think by equal measures of vanity, ignorance of data, and fear of ridicule, scientists shy away from the subject. If they paid more attention to the data, I think they'd feel more comfortable with it. In fact, we find a lot of scientists who hold what I consider a totally irrational belief that if we ever discover extraterrestrial life, it will be us who does the discovering, the Seti people, that we will pick up radio signals from space. I consider that totally irrational. They should start looking a little closer to Earth. I'm going to briefly go over some of my experiences that got me started in the UFO field, but a lot of this has been published elsewhere. In fact, I tend to give a public talk about once every 20 years, and my last one was 1978, MUFON UFO Symposium in Dayton. I graduated from Tulane University and with majoring in philosophy, logic, scientific method, minor in mathematics, and I moved to Washington in 1958, and I've been around this area ever since. I have some slides here. See if I can activate this thing. The slides mostly come in the early part of the talk, and then we can turn the lights back up. Do I press forward to get the first one? Oh, it's already there. Okay. This is the example, one of the skeptics at the press conference yesterday was talking about why don't you suggest a bunch of hardcore cases for people to investigate? Well, they're all over the literature. I don't need to suggest them. This is one. This is Captain William Nash, who had one of the sightings in July 1952, Pan Am pilot, flying south of Washington, and a formation of glowing red disc-shaped objects approached below the level of his aircraft, inline formation. They encountered the aircraft. They came to a screeching stop, so to speak, and to show that there's sort of human error involved, there was a slight overrun in the formation. One of the discs slid up too far. They stopped, flipped up on edge in unison, reversed direction, and shot back at like a 30-degree angle. Now, swamp gas, natural phenomenon? I don't think so. But that's just one example. And Bill Nash was later a NICAP advisor for a number of years and flew for Pan Am long term, very long term. It was this kind of sighting that intrigued me about the UFO phenomenon. Then while I was going to Tulane University, the first flap of UFO sightings in 5 years happened mostly in November 1957. And I had just learned recently about NICAP and got in touch with Major Kehoe. This was my first real field investigation experience insofar as I could spare the time from my studies, but I gathered information and forwarded it to Washington. And the following year, when I moved to Washington, NICAP had only been in existence for about a year at that point, and the small staff took me around the office, opened a closet door, and pulled out huge cartons of clippings and sighting reports from the November 1957 wave, including the stuff I had sent in. They were just overwhelmed with it, couldn't deal with it. There was so much material. During the NICAP years, more relevant to my present talk, I interacted with the Washington, D.C. press corps extensively. Used to know all the guys on the Washington Post, the then Washington Star and Daily News, various other, and the TV media, radio. And we occasionally would have a press conference when there was some big event at the National Press Club, and we had interaction. I had interaction with members of Congress, members of the executive agencies, including the CIA, a story that I reported in my book, where when things started getting interesting in 1965, a CIA representative, I don't want to say agent, that's not the right term, he was a domestic contact person, came around and interviewed me at the office about the sightings and everything. I had contact with members of foreign embassies. I compared information, exchanged information with members of foreign embassy staff. One critical point, when things started getting hot, there was a call from the State Department saying, we have a couple of Argentine newsmen that would like to come interview you. And we made an appointment. They came, walked in the door, and handed out credentials. They were from Argentine Air Force Intelligence. They were using the news media as a cover story. They wanted to find out what we were learning and how we were organized, because they wanted to set up a major study patterned after us in Argentina. During the early years of NICAP, there was a major drought of sightings, which I've in fact written about for the QFOS International UFO Reporter. from 1959 to 1963, basically my first 5 years at NICAP, there were practically no sightings. They just sort of ceased. And even with retrospective research, you can hardly find any good sightings from that period. You can find a few. And so it was at that point that Major Kehoe conceived the idea for the UFO evidence report. We needed to pull together all the best evidence and get it out there to news media, Congress. We worked on Congress a lot for the main reason that the Air Force in those days, this is something modern-day ufologists probably don't understand very well, the Air Force had absolute control over the subject. They were officially charged with the investigation of UFOs by the government. Any reports from any government agencies were filtered through the Air Force, and they were responsible for investigating them and issuing public reports and analyzing what was going on. And they were very negative in debunking. And so we were pitted against the Air Force, not by choice, but that's just the way things worked out. And so we developed UFO evidence, and with a little help from the UFOs, this had quite a big impact, because about the time it was published in 1964, the Socorro, New Mexico sighting came along. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, even though it's sort of ancient history at this point. But basically, it was a physical evidence case. A structured craft, elliptical, was on the ground, sighted by Officer Lonnie Zamora in Socorro, New Mexico. He approached to investigate, looking at it and thinking it must be an overturned car. Again, this is one of those escalation of hypotheses things that Alan Hynek talked about. You first try to fit it in to something familiar, and he approached it, and all of a sudden he saw two figures standing next to it, which he assumed were the occupants, probably rightly so, but not the type of vehicle he was thinking about. They disappeared. There was a noise, a roar. The thing started taking off and kicking up dust and flame, leveled off, became totally silent, and then began moving off horizontally at a slight rising course and went on over the mountains. He immediately called for backup. A state trooper came in time to see the mesquite bushes still burning, deep imprints in the soil, etc. Mr. Skeptic, there's a good one for you too. To this day, in fact, Major Hector Quintanilla, the former head of Project Blue Book, later wrote a study for the intelligence community about that case and how totally baffling it was, and even now they still can't explain it. They checked for every experimental vehicle anywhere in the government. They could find nothing to account for it. But things really started getting hot about 1965 when sightings began picking up, and a certain party named Dr. James McDonald got interested and got involved. And then all of a sudden, here came probably what is one of the biggest, longest, most continuous UFO waves of all times, from 1966 through 1968. And that's where probably the rest of my slides are going to focus. Let's see if this works now. Okay, that's Major Donald Kehoe, late of NICAP, whom I worked with for a number of years, many years. I refuse to wear trifocals, so I have to go back and forth. That's the Socorro, New Mexico case that I just referred to. That's the local newspaper coverage of it. Original data, so to speak. Obviously, you can't literally trust newspaper accounts, but this was pretty good reporting, as later fully verified. And that is a very intriguing case for those of you who are not familiar with it. You ought to look it up. There's an awful lot to it. Then, as the interest started picking up, the interest came from the United Nations. I don't know if you can read that. It's hard to see from here, but it's a letter from the Secretary to Utah, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in answer to a query I had sent him. They were expressing a lot of interest and have off and on throughout history. Nothing came of it typically, but they have occasionally held serious discussions about UFOs in the United Nations, and that's one hope of eventually of getting around our own government's intransigence on this subject. Okay, here we go with the famous swamp gas incidents. I'm sure many of you may not even have been alive when this happened. You must have heard of swamp gas. And the swamp gas is going to be kind of thick this morning because a lot of my slides have to do with that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get an array of slides done. That's Dr. Allen Hynek at the famous press conference in Michigan in March of 1966. There was a huge outbreak of sightings, and they gradually spread to Massachusetts. There was another concentration there, and scattered other locations, but there was a strong concentration in Michigan. The Air Force, it was getting so much national attention in major news media, including Life magazine, outfits like that, that the Air Force called an urgent press conference and pretty much told Allen Hynek to go out there and explain this. And so he shopped around the best he could and made a weak reply about swamp gas. Maybe it was swamp gas. It happened, some of them happened in marshy areas, and you have this phenomenon called swamp gas, methane spontaneously igniting and so forth. And that became the butt of innumerable cartoons and so forth. And Allen Hynek, to his credit, in his later years went around showing a lot of those cartoons. And one of them showed little green men with ray guns saying, "Take me to the professor who called us swamp gas." This is more of the same, but it got tremendous coverage because there was this interest. So this kind of headline appeared in newspapers all over the country. If you wonder what swamp gas looks like, this is what one of the main witnesses described. Obviously a very structured object and disc-shaped. This one was hovering in a marshy area, yes, and it had brilliantly glowing lights, and it was surrounded by cops trying to figure out what it was, and then they kept trying to close in and get a look at it, and it finally took off, and it illuminated the area, and it buzzed a patrol car, and so forth, and that's pretty powerful swamp gas. Then along came, if Bill Weitzel's here, he's here at the conference. He was the NICAP investigator on this case, which then stirred up even more interest. This came in April of 1966, where two policemen in Ravenna, Ohio, were at work and investigating an abandoned vehicle, and all of a sudden a gigantic object rose up out of the woods on the side of the road, illuminated the road all around them, hovered, and then started moving away. And they called their dispatcher and they said, "Follow it, don't let it get away." And I guess dispatchers say what they have to say, and so they dutifully chased it for 90-some miles into Pennsylvania, and it kept slowing down and speeding up. And they would start catching up to it, and then it would zoom away and so forth. And the interesting thing is that they were in communication, radio communication with a lot of other police, and guys from other jurisdictions would be waiting alongside the road, and here would come the UFO, just like they were describing, and they would pick up the chase, and pretty soon there was a whole chain of police cars chasing this thing into Pennsylvania. Well, the Air Force called it the planet Venus, and one other, I forget what their other, they had two explanations for it. But this stirred up a congressional inquiry by the local congressman, and incidentally, the Michigan sighting stirred up a huge congressional inquiry because one of the congressmen affected was Representative Gerald Ford, and he was instrumental in bringing about finally the congressional hearings that really blew the lid off of Project Blue Book and forced a reinvestigation and forced an outside study to be done. So these were very significant sightings in UFO history. Then along came Roscoe Drummond, who was a columnist, was he in the Post? I think he was. And he was a major syndicated columnist, and unlike a lot of news media people, he came around to the office, asked to see documentation, asked to see case studies, which we provided him, and he became a strong supporter of having a serious scientific investigation done and getting it out of the Air Force's hands. So he was a big ally in that respect. But he did his homework, which is the important point. This is an interesting historical photograph. It seems to be, from my perspective, a little whited out by that bright light over there. What is that light doing anyway? Can that be? It's blinding me. The guy on the left is Thornton Page of the famous Robertson panel. The guy in the middle is the late John Fuller, the columnist whose books and writings in Saturday Review and elsewhere were instrumental in getting serious attention. And the guy on the far right is the late Dr. James McDonald. Yay. So now I need a light for the podium. I can't see. No, that's okay. That's good. I can live with that level. There are only a few more slides anyway, so. Guess who that is? Oh, it's labeled. Okay. That's me in 1966. When the Colorado UFO study, University of Colorado was ultimately the agency that was given a grant by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research to check on Project Blue Book's findings and to do their own independent investigation. And Major Kehoe and I were invited to be among the first briefers for them. That's fine, light level. I don't need any more. And so we rendezvoused, I think, in Chicago and flew out together on TWA to Denver, and we drank a toast to the United States Air Force. And we received VIP treatment from TWA because there was a lot of interest.
I'm sorry. Is it necessary for the video?
Oh, okay. All right, there's only... There's only going to be one or two more slides, so... Anyway, we were escorted off the plane in Denver. We were told there was a gigantic gaggle of news media waiting to interview us, and they took us into a VIP room where we could gather our wits, and we came out. We were interviewed right in the Denver airport. That's where that was taken. Well, I can't even read this one. I don't know. I think that may be some notes from one of the meetings at the University of Colorado. We can dispense with that, and I think that may be the last one. Yeah, okay, now you can turn up the lights to your heart's content. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the most significant things that happened during all this excitement over the new waves of UFO sightings was that a bunch of scientists came out, what we call the scientific underground, or what was Hynek's name for it, the Invisible College, which has always existed. I'm sure it still does today. There are lots of scientists at major institutions that would love to investigate UFOs if they were, officially recognized in some sense as at least a legitimate scientific mystery. They'd be delighted to study it. Well, they started coming out of the woodwork, and there were lots of them were household names until the debunking report came along from the University of Colorado, and they became quite invisible again. So one point I'm trying to make is I've seen these cycles for a long time. The growing interest on the part of news media. The news media during the sighting period I was talking about were editorializing major news media, Christian Science Monitor, Kansas City Star. It's time for the government to stop lying to us. Let's have a serious scientific investigation. And I can document this. In fact, I do in the new volume of UFO Evidence. And so there have been cycles in news media interest and coverage, cycles in scientific interest. Every so often enough happens that they're more or less forced to take a look at the subject in a hopefully more systematic, organized way. something happens, they fall apart. When I was a consultant to the Colorado project, there were a lot of individual scientists that were very good and very serious about it, but they suffered from an unfortunate lack of leadership from the top. It's a long story, but I recommend to any scholars and news media present that there is an article by Dr. Michael Swords in the Journal of UFO Studies, published by the Center for UFO Studies, that goes back, analyzes the files of the Colorado project and Dr. Condon's personal files, and comes out with a scathing review of how unscientific the Colorado project was. I know I'm very amused by the fact that the local skeptics chapter puts up the Condon report on their website as if this is a great proof of their position. I would wish everybody would look at that report and study it very carefully. It would help our cause a great deal because it was a very unscientific study. Why? Well, that's very complicated. Deep prejudices, resistances, which I'm going to get into a little more. Now, the UFO evidence was, the original volume in 1964 was very instrumental in getting a lot of serious attention to the subject. In recent years, the last several years, on a commission from the UFO Research Coalition, I have written volume 2 of the UFO evidence. This time it covers a period of approximately 35 years, and it's 500 or 600 pages long. And among other things, it absolutely confirms and replicates every pattern that was shown in the first volume, and plus it adds a few new ones that weren't quite so obvious at that time. And of course, the abduction phenomenon was just barely beginning to come into awareness at that time, and so the new volume has in-depth coverage of that, including an original essay by Eddie Bullard analyzing the emergence of the abduction phenomenon out of the general background of UFO sightings, which is very interesting. But basically, it's data-oriented, facts and case histories and so forth. But to me, one of the most interesting things I discovered, which was a surprise to me, I went back and reviewed vast amounts of UFO literature, all the MUFON UFO journals, the International UFO Reporters. I borrowed somebody's collection of Flying Saucer Review, which at times has been the closest thing we have to a journal of record in the field. And I was astounded, frankly, by what I found. Scientists and skeptics say there's nothing there to investigate. Baloney. There is ample data. There's a lot of very interesting data in there, and there's a whole segment out of it. I devote an entire section to structure, lights, and colors is one section. Another section is motions and flight patterns. What I discovered was the stereotype that UFOs are silent is only partly so. It's a stereotype. There are lots of noise-emitting UFOs that may have become more obvious since 1964. But anyway, I document that sort of thing. And what was the UFO doing? Did it change color when it made a turn? I was surprised to find out there are all kinds of potential clues to the physics of UFOs. There are spark, smoke, flame, color changes, pulsations of light, light beams, and the sequence in which these things occur and the time at which they occur is very fascinating. There's some very interesting patterns there, and it deserves very thorough, careful scientific study. I also, in this new volume of UFO evidence, get into some analysis of this very issue. What are the reasons for science and the government failing to recognize the reality of UFOs and confronting it? And I'm very disappointed and disillusioned that our major institutions have failed us so badly, but on the other hand, I think I at least partially understand why. It's just too much to swallow. It's a very revolutionary, far more than you might realize at first thought. If you really think about it, you're asking people to accept that there's an almost miraculous technology flying around here. It borders on the supernatural almost. Although when you start analyzing it more closely, there are clues that the physics is not that different. It's most likely some kind of a projection of ours. We could learn a lot by studying it, and we could advance our science a great deal. But they're a very difficult pill to swallow. For science, it would require a revision of a lot of scientific theories, not to mention admission of having been wrong for a long period of time. The implication of it is that our science is not even close to being the pinnacle of achievement in the universe. I think it was Dr. Alan Hynek who made that point. Politically, it's a hot potato. For politicians to take UFOs seriously, they need to get around the tabloid and pseudoscience image that it unfortunately has. And they need to have the backing of some scientists. They need credible people in the community to stand up and speak out. And the news media tend to see, as we saw in the Post, and just as I predicted, we're an curious sociological phenomenon. And they don't seem to be able to get beyond that. And they won't unless some scientists speak out or some serious studies are done. So it gets to be kind of a vicious circle. And also, these institutions have gotten entangled in a self-reinforcing pattern of circular reasoning that blinds them to what is going on. They think we are self-deluded. My conclusion is that they are self-deluded. They are misled by their own biases and presumptions and lack of investigation. Now, in closing, and I'm going to come in under time as I usually do, I'm going to read some of my conclusions just to make sure I get it straight, because I put a lot of thought into this. I have to some extent lived the politics of UFOs and observed at close hand the comfort zone problems, including people from all walks of life who are trying to come to grips with bizarre data that doesn't fit in any convenient pigeonhole. More often than not, their experiences cause them great discomfort. It's not, contrary to what the skeptics, the debunkers, I'm going to call them, like to say, it's not some self-gratification or wishful thinking or looking for saviors from space. It scares the hell out of people. It upsets their lives. And so it's a false, very false argument by the debunkers. It also causes discomfort to the major institutions of society. It's very hard to deal with. To make a long story short, I've concluded that the skeptical view that's espoused by people like Psychop and the Florida skeptics is not only wrong, it's profoundly wrong. They're doing a great disservice by not acting like real skeptics and saying, let's take a good, thorough look at the evidence. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical. I can respect any honest skeptic, but you shouldn't have to modify the word skeptic by honest. They should be honest to begin with. And as I said yesterday at the press conference, the self-styled scientific investigators of claims of the paranormal are neither scientific nor do they investigate. Their minds are made up. It's obvious in a lot of the questions they even ask. But they do this, the traditional skeptics, and I studied philosophy formally, and I studied logic and scientific method too, but they do not investigate. UFOs can't exist, period. If you ask them if they ever investigate, they claim to investigate, let's put it that way, but they actually don't. What they do is try to pin a label on a case or look for some minor flaw in the character of the witness or use an argument, well, if it really happened, why didn't somebody over here see it, which is utterly irrelevant. I mean, there are lots of things that happen that only some people happen to see for one reason or another. But they are the ones who are the defenders of the status quo, fighting off what I now consider to be overwhelming evidence. And it tends to undermine their worldview. They have a problem too. They're not alone, because the full range of evidence when it's presented will undermine a lot of people's beliefs. And I hope the UFO Evidence Volume 2 will make a strong contribution to doing that, because it's needed. We need to face up to what's going on and get scientific about it. What we as a society need to do is, entirely in keeping with accepted scientific method, is to do a better job of gathering and studying UFO data and to adjust our scientific concepts and theories accordingly. At present, we're in a strong stage of data denial, and that is not science. What can we as ufologists do to bypass the political stalemate and make acceptance of UFOs more comfortable? First of all, we need to do a much better job of policing our own ranks and adhering to sound scientific methods. UFOs are not a matter of belief. I hate that word. This is not a religion, despite you can joke about that, but it's not a religion. That use of the word implies an uncritical acceptance of something without thorough analysis. But I'm afraid that the kooks that attach themselves to the subject and the ones that go off with extreme theories and claims are contaminating the credibility of the UFO field. There was a question yesterday in the press conference about, is there a developing schism in the UFO community? And I said, no, it's been there all along. We need to thoroughly investigate and carefully document the serious evidence and present the sifted and validated data to the scientific community, the news media, and the government with minimal speculation. Careless speculation, shoddy logic detract from the message we should be trying to convey. A recognition of the reality, the validity of the data will automatically lead to the kind of full discussion and scientific study that is now and always will be beyond our funding level and abilities to bring about. For the large majority of us, UFO research can only be a part-time profession. We are basically weekend warriors. We've done a lot of good work. There's no question about that, but we should drop any pretense that we in our spare time scientific minds in the room. It's a pretense that we'll figure it out by ourselves without funding and without good scientific brains. Our much more modest goal should be to marshal good information as a means of calling the attention of the major institutions of society to the reality and potentially profound significance of UFOs. And then it will be the job of all members of society to work together to discover the ultimate answers. Thank you very much.